Hello and welcome to Biblical Justice A to X. If you're joining us in the live audience, please be sure to turn off your other computer programs for the best audiovisual experience. Global Justice is pleased to present Biblical Justice A to X, a monthly video conference that discusses a range of critical justice issues from abortion to xenophobia. In this session, we'll be focusing on the key foundational concern of poverty. I'm Sosamma Samuel-Burnett, founder and president of Global Justice, and I'll be serving as moderator for this session. And I'm so pleased to be joined today by Larry Smith, president and chief executive officer of Catholic Charities-Denver. Welcome, Larry.
Good evening. How are you, Sosamma? It's good to see you.
Good to see you too. Thanks so much for joining us. You know, before we get into our questions about this really important topic of poverty, we thought it'd be important to just sort of get to know you and get to know the work of Catholic Charities first. So would you walk us through that first?
Sure. So Larry Smith, I'm the CEO of Catholic Charities for the Archdiocese of Denver. We cover about 40,000 square miles in the northern third of the state of Colorado. We have about a $45 to $48 million budget, depending on the things that we throw together. And we served last year about 110,000 people. We operate 7 primary ministerial units. Affordable housing is our largest with 29. We just opened our 29th apartment building. We also provide shelter. We have 4 shelters that we provide in the Archdiocese. We have 6 early childhood education centers. We have a program for seniors and family services. We have a community and family services group, community and outreach program. We also have something called Marisol Services, which is predominantly for women and single women and children. It offers medical services, housing, counseling, educational services, everything that a young mother who might be in risk of an abortion and then maybe is just homeless due to domestic violence or some, those kinds of things, can come, and no matter where they are in that continuum, we can help them get back on their feet, and we provide all services necessary to do that. And then we also have a counseling program called Sacred Heart Counseling here in Denver. So those are our primary ministerial units, and we're 724, always looking out for God's less fortunate brothers and sisters.
Wonderful. You have such a range of programs, and we so appreciate all that you're doing. And these centers are throughout the country, not just limited to Colorado, correct?
Yes. There's obviously Catholic Charities in every diocese across the country. I think there's over 150 dioceses in the United States. And each bishop in a diocese has its own Catholic Charities organization. And then we have a kind of an umbrella organization called Catholic Charities USA, which goes along with the United States Council of Catholic Bishops to provide sort of an overview and a lobbying and a national fundraising perspective for all the activities that we do in all the different dioceses. And then, of course, we have an international concern called Caritas, which is Catholic Charities International, and that's aligned with Pope Francis and the bishops around the world.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that overview. That's been so helpful as we get into our topic. So let's just dive right in. Yeah. The issue of poverty is huge. It is something that most people are familiar with as a concern in many different ways. But I'd really like to set the stage for our audience and let them know what should they know about the topic of poverty today.
Well, the first thing I would say is that sometimes we forget what poverty really looks like. And before I talk about those who are materially poor, we sometimes forget about those who are spiritually poor. And I just want to touch on that for a second, because it's sometimes those who are spiritually poor that wind up being material poor. And we don't reach out to people, our friends, our neighbors, those that are closest to us. We think that we can only go to Calcutta, India, as Mother Teresa did, and provide services to the poor. And nothing is further from the truth. It's your brother and sister, your wife, your children, your neighbor who may be suffering in unbelievable ways that we don't think about because they're not hungry necessarily, right? Or they have a house to live in. And so that's the first thing I would point out, is that the poor come in both material and the spiritual. It's easy to see the man on the street holding up a sign who's saying, he's poor. And currently, in the United States, I'll read you just a couple of brief statistics because I don't want to bore you to death with it, but it's important to point out that we currently have about 15% of our population, 13.5% in the year 2015, fell below the poverty rate, and that's a family of 4 making $24,000 or less. It is interesting to point out that when we talk about families, that families who are missing a mother, or wife rather, they will quite often be a single parent father, will be 14% of the time likely to be below the poverty line. But if you're a single mother with children, you're likely to be below the poverty almost 30% of the time, the basic poverty line. And we forget about some of these things. The other thing is that, you know, because, and this is a personal opinion, because so much of our poverty we think is taken care of by the government, we forget sometimes that it's really up to us to help the poor, just as it tells us in the Bible. And we think, well, the government's got it. Well, we've spent $20 trillion in the last 50, 60 years since 1964, and we haven't really seen a material decline in the percentage of people living in poverty. And that's because I think some of us have forgotten that it's up to us to help our brothers and sisters who are living below or at the poverty line, spiritually or materially, and especially, it's obvious, materially. And that's where Catholic Charities steps in, and that's some of the things we're trying to do. In the city of Denver, we focus primarily on single women. All of our new initiatives focus on single women and children and seniors. And I'm happy to say that in Denver in the last 3 years, through a partnership, in a loose partnership and affiliation with the Denver Rescue Mission, the Salvation Army, and Volunteers of America, we've been able to focus our time and energy in all of our new initiatives on servicing the single women and children and seniors who are in the homeless state in Denver. And we now have about 250 beds dedicated that are owned and managed by Catholic Charities. 3 years ago, there probably weren't 50 beds in the entire city of Denver for single women, whereas there are 1,000 per minute.
And you raised so many great points. I just want to touch on a couple of them. One of them is this idea of sort of the face of poverty, that poverty affects many people across, many different, cultural groups, many different ages, but predominantly we're seeing women and children, elderly, correct? And what would you say that is? What's the context for that?
Well, I would argue that if you go anywhere in the world, women and children are the most persecuted and put upon demographic in any country that you go to, right? Look at how women are treated all across the globe. We really have to take a step back and wonder why this amazing creature created by God to bring new life into the world and to nurture our very children are treated so poorly. And it's sad. I mean, it's really shameful how we do this as a society. Without realizing it, in Denver, as an example, we had, as I was starting to say, about 2,000 beds for men and maybe 50 for women. And so we're changing that gradually as we're starting to increase that, and the same structure for women and children. A lot of times, because jobs and the commercial markets are dominated by men, we forget about the women. Now, fortunately, if a woman is married to a man who has a job, and I'm not suggesting women shouldn't work or that they're not equal, they're very much equal to men in every respect. But in our society sometimes, where the areas are dominated by men, they're pushed to the side, and children are as well, unless they can be utilized for something that's convenient for the people in control. And that's sort of where, you go back to some of the biblical references about the poor and the needy and taking care of the hungry, the sick, the naked, the thirsty. That's who they turn out to be. And so we really have to stop and take inventory of who is being put upon, who is providing services and not being compensated appropriately, and what is our future? Because really, if you look at the nurture of our society and the future of our society, it's women and children. And so we really need to take a step back and try and focus on helping them get, a hand up, not just a hand out, but a hand up on self-sufficiency and the dignity that God gave every human being out there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Larry. And I also want to touch on the fact that you mentioned community, that this is a topic that isn't just something for the government to deal with. It's really for individuals and community members and organizations. So would you expand a little bit about that and the significance of that piece in addressing poverty?
Yes. Before I do that, I want to say that there are absolutely amazing people working for the government. So I'm not criticizing the people that are working for the government, but when you're part of a $1 trillion budget, it's easy to get lost in terms of where you fit. And with some of these government programs, there are programs upon programs upon programs. And when I look around at the things that are most successful, it's programs like the partnerships I just talked about here in Denver. Catholic Charities, Volunteers of America, Denver Rescue Mission, Salvation Army, and then a bunch of other smaller programs. Urban Peak is a phenomenal program here in Denver that treats homeless youth And there are many others, right? And so, but when you look at where the energy and where the resources are coming from with these kinds of programs, it's almost always local. It's a local church. It's a community organization, religious or non-religious, that really care about their neighbors and want to help. Now, they may get government funding, but it's when the money gets into the hands of the local operative, the people in the neighborhood who are trying to care for their brothers and sisters, that miracles happen. And so I like to focus on people at the grassroots. You know, Mother Teresa was great about this, and she said, you know, you don't need to go to Calcutta to help the poor. Do it in your town, do it in your neighborhood, do it in your house. And it's really, that's where it starts, right? The other thing, this real quick, Sosamma, we just opened an apartment complex in Greeley this past week. We had 160 people come to the opening, and it is a homeless first initiative housing property, which means people coming out of homelessness are given their first shot at the apartment. The day we had our grand opening, we finished our lease up in about 40 days. Amazing staff work, and we had every unit filled. The Church of the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, bought the furniture for all 47 units. The Mennonites came up and helped out. The Lutherans were there. So it was really a community organization like G.L.O.B.A.L barn raising. And that, to me, is the essence of how we help our brothers and sisters together as individuals.
Absolutely. And I really appreciate that you give those examples of how the community can come together. The government has a role, but the community itself affects itself. This broader context of biblical justice, certainly poverty is mentioned in the Bible many times, but why should we be concerned with poverty as a biblical justice matter?
Well, you know, it goes back to the Old Testament, right? You can go to Exodus, Deuteronomy. It's referenced throughout the Old and New Testament that you are going to have the poor with you. And it's us that have to help them. It's individuals. And God is asking us to do it. Not everybody is blessed with the same talents and skills. And in any society, different talents and skills are valued differently economically. And those who have the greatest economic benefit, because they have whatever talent is most valuable at that particular time with that particular society, needs to turn around and look at the people that help support them by doing all the work they don't have to do. And sometimes those people aren't as benefited economically as the other individuals, so they need to share. And, you know, in the Acts of the Apostles, people sold all their goods and gave them to the local church in order to be a part of the early Christian church, right? And if you look at Jesus when he was sitting there, you know, and Mary was pouring the oil over his feet, and Judas said, "Oh, don't do that, we'll give it to the poor." And he said, you know, you're always going to have the poor. And I think what he was talking about in that is the reference to it's our job, individuals, not just Jesus, but us as the brothers and sisters of the poor, to help them, to really dig down deep and think, what can I do? And it may be a weekly volunteer, it may be coaching your son's basketball, your daughter's basketball or volleyball or football team or whatever they're on, and participating in the lives of the youth and of seniors, visiting seniors in a nursing home. I mean, it doesn't have to just be feeding the poor. It doesn't have to be building a house. It can be something simple, and it's these little acts of kindness that Jesus talks about in the Bible that I think change the world one person at a time, and that's why it's so important. And a final thought on that is, I was talking to somebody the other day, and they said, "Oh, I can't wait to get this new car. I'm so happy about it." And I said, "Wow, that's great. You're going to be happy." I said, how do you think you're going to feel in a month? And they said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, in a month, it won't be a new car. You'll be, you know, yeah, but I'll have that car." I said, "Well, how did you feel at Christmas when you gave your wife that present that she was really looking forward to, or at your daughter's birthday present, or, you know, how did you feel when you gave that to them and you saw them open it and how happy it?" And they said, "Well, I was joyful." And I said, "Exactly. It's in giving that we find real joy, not just happiness." And that's the key. You know, in the Catholic Church, we talk about the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. And the corporal works of mercy, feeding, you know, feeding the homeless, providing shelter for the homeless, you know, looking after the sick. But there's also giving alms to the poor. There's aspects of it that just involve visiting the sick, visiting. That could be an elderly, you know, parent. It could be so many different things that are simple. It doesn't have to be dramatic. And I think that's important. We gain joy by giving, not by receiving.
Absolutely, and especially when you think about this holiday season, that's a good reminder that message comes through. More than the greeting cards, it's this idea of true joy.
Right.
And There's a wonderful, biblical example where, Jesus tells us what you do for the least of these, you do for me. And so
Right.
I think that's really what you're describing here, this idea of really representing Christ, doing this on behalf of Christ. We're his hands and feet. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. Everything we have comes from Jesus Christ, God the Father Almighty. And it's his. I mean, why are we holding on to it like it matters to us? When we die, we go to join God in heaven. There's this great video that I saw recently about the great big God, and it was a evangelical pastor in Atlanta, and he was talking about how big God is, and he was using an explanation of the universe to describe it. He started with the Earth, and then he gradually got to bigger and bigger planets, and then he started talking about these suns, these stars, and how big they were. And the final star was so big that when you put our sun on the same screen as this star, our sun with the ratios were correct, you couldn't even see it. The sun was so big. And he said, God breathed life. God said, let there be light, and he breathed life, and there was light. He's talking about the universe, and the universe is something like 30 billion light years across. You think about how massive, how great God is, and how small we are, and all he asks us to do is to really love our neighbors as ourselves. And the beautiful thing about that is that loving our neighbors as ourselves require us to first love ourselves, right? Because you can't love your neighbor if you don't love yourself, because how else would you know how to do it? And then to share that love with someone else, and that is joyful, and that's giving God back the great gifts that he gave us. And at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. And whether you're in Europe or Asia or America or wherever, it's the same thing. It's the same God and the same love and the same joy that we're being asked to share no matter where we go.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Larry. I think that statement encapsulated that concept of biblical justice so well for this topic. I do want to transition a little bit and talk about this topic of poverty on a broader scale. Obviously, we have a great deal of poverty-stricken people in our own country here in the United States. But, there are statistics that show that, maybe even as many as 80% of the world's population lives in some level of poverty. And Catholic Charities certainly works internationally as well. Give us a little bit of an understanding of the connection of this topic globally.
Well, the beautiful thing about Catholic Charities is that we are connected internationally through Caritas International. And recently, we've had these massive floods and hurricanes in the Caribbean, and which affected the southern part of the United States, Puerto Rico, and all the Caribbean islands. But we've been sending people to those locations to help out from our facility here in Denver. And I know that other Catholic charities across the country have as well. We also work with Caritas International to provide resources in places like Africa and Asia where they really have very little. Being poor is being poor. And when you're here in the United States and you have food insecurity and you live in a 500 square foot house with 4 people, you're poor. But when you live in Africa and Asia, you might have a tent. You might have a hut. You might be, in a refugee camp where you really have absolutely nothing. And with the crisis going on in the Middle East, Pope Francis has been very clear about, and actually the United States Council of Catholic Bishops have just put together an initiative for refugees and how to reach out and help them. And these are the poorest of the poor. They have left everything behind in their countries. They've moved on, and they are being taken advantage of time and time again. If you look at the refugees coming from South America and Central America trying to get to the U.S., and the struggles that they're having and the abuses that they're suffering through just to get here by people who are taking advantage of them physically and economically and certainly emotionally and spiritually, it really brings tears to your eyes. It brings you to your knees. So we need to reach out and be cognizant of that. We send resources through, obviously from Denver, it's hard to send water or things like that, but we work with people who are, for instance, hydrologists in this one case, that take technologies and resources overseas to work with people in other countries. And whether that be economic or prayer, it's always something that we've got to remember and to think about and keep, in the center of our heart and the center of our prayer, because it's the only way we're really going to change the world.
Absolutely. And, you're reminding us that poverty, while poverty is poverty, there are levels and extremes of poverty. And
Sure.
some of what we've experiencing here in the United States might be radically difficult, but at the same time could be very different than what we see in other parts of the world, like the examples that you've described. You also mentioned this idea of the vulnerable populations. It seems that if you are poverty-stricken, you are also more likely to be threatened by all these other risk factors, whether that be disease or whether that be other types of disparities, or whether that is just simply political and other types of oppressions. So, would you speak to that a little bit about sort of how poverty makes us a little bit more insecure in those other contexts?
Oh, sure. Well, I think the best example is that if you haven't eaten for a couple of days and somebody has money and they have food and you don't, you're likely to do a lot of things to get that food. Even worse if you haven't had something to drink. If you're thirsty, really thirsty, you'll do a lot for a glass of water. And this is especially sensitive for women and children and seniors. But women and children more so than seniors, and only because sometimes we look at seniors like they're worn out, they're not good for anything. Nothing could be further from the truth. But with children and with women, they're taken advantage of by some really unscrupulous people that are out there. People who clearly must not have God in their lives because of the way that they're treating their brothers and sisters. And what we're seeing with the homeless women that are coming to our shelters, the vast majority have suffered rape at least once. We're talking 70 to 80 percentile. They've been forced into prostitution and sex trafficking. They've been forced into carrying drugs, as an example, in an illegal manner for drug dealers and things of that nature. They're forced into doing labor jobs that don't pay anything, and then they're not paid, and then they're forced again to give sexual favors or physical favors or whatever it may be. They're really just taken advantage of because they don't have the resources to take care of themselves. Same thing, and even worse for children, is that they are just seriously abused, especially those who are in a migratory state. And I can tell you stories that we hear all the time from people who've gotten into the United States, struggled coming up through the Latin America, Central America to get here, and the abuses that they've gone through by the handlers that are carrying them, in these vans and whatever that means of transportation that they use. It's beyond degrading, and we really got to think about what we can do to stop that, because it's tragic. And you're seeing that in the Middle East as well now. You're seeing that in the migrant population moving from the Middle East up into Europe. The folks in some of the war-torn areas of Africa, especially on the eastern horn of Africa, and Somalia, and some of those areas over. It's horrible. So we really got to take the time to think about how can we help them, and what do we do as people, with the limited resources we have, to really get together and try and help that. So for the folks out there that are wondering, there are a number of phenomenal international organizations, Caritas International, that they should think about information to and praying for, and even contributing some of their personal resources, however they're endowed to do that.
Absolutely. And there's so many linked issues with this. For example, we had a conversation with a physician recently who said, I could provide medicine to a person and give them directions to take that medicine with food. But what happens when the individual doesn't have food? So, the lack of those basic needs then makes it difficult to provide other types of services on top of that. So I really appreciate what you're saying, that there's so many different organizations that might take a piece or part of that broader set of concerns around poverty. We also want to take a little bit of time to talk about just a little bit of what you're doing presently. If there's specific things that you'd like to highlight, and some time that we could spend on programs that you may want to share with our audience.
Yeah, the thing that we're trying to do right now is to make sure that the resources that we're putting together when we help single women and children, that we provide something we call the continuum of care. One of the things that we try and do, for instance, in stopping abortion, is not to just give a young woman or a woman who is pregnant and experiencing an unexpected or crisis pregnancy an ultrasound and a pregnancy test and encourage her not to have an abortion. I mean, that's good. We want to do that, but that stops short of providing the comprehensive services that this woman may need in order to carry that baby through to birth and beyond and have a life with that child. And so the thing that we've put together in Denver is called the continuum of care. And we converted our pregnancy centers to medical clinics. We've renovated and doubled the size of our single women and children's facilities. We've gone from 1 facility to 4. with different types of houses. 2 of them are designed as potential maternity homes where pregnant women can live in community with other women, sober, with a house mother, with counseling, with educational services, maybe GED classes or whatever they need to get back on their feet from an educational standpoint, and then apartment hunting services, job hunting services, medical services, counseling services, all the things that may be needed to help that woman get back on her feet and have a loving and stable life. It's important for that woman to know she's loved. And a lot of these situations, when, think about it, women were not designed to abort their children, as an example. You know, God made them to carry and nurture those children. And so it's our job, we feel, to help them know that they're loved, and then to provide them the resources they need to not just have the baby, not just to say yes to life, but to have a life with the baby. And so we talk about pro-life as conception to natural death, and we mean it, and we provide services that fill that gap. Now, we don't try and do everything, but we will if we have to. So we have a lot of partnerships. We love to set up partnerships because not one organization can do everything. But to the extent that we have to, we do what we need to do to make sure that these women and their children are properly taken care of, including early childhood education starting at 6 weeks all the way through high school. If we need to, we can put them in Catholic high schools and grade schools, or work with them to get them into public grade schools and high schools. I mean, there are great institutions out there doing great things with these kids, especially kids that are needy and have some additional needs due to some of the things that they've suffered through. So that's the focus of Catholic Charities, is really to provide a comprehensive handout, not just a handout.
Oh, that's great. I appreciate you mentioning this abortion issue as well as it relates to poverty, since many abortion centers are located in poverty centers, disproportionately so. And so to give these alternate options for these women, and also the services to support them. You know, it's one thing to say have a child, but another thing to provide them a network of opportunities and services and resources to help them raise that child. And so we really appreciate all that you're doing there at Catholic Charities. Now, if individuals from our audience are interested in learning more about Catholic Charities-Denver and or giving or volunteering with your group, how do they find out more information?
The easiest way is to go to www.ccdenver.org. That's our website, and it's a pretty comprehensive website. It provides a listing and an explanation of the 7 primary ministerial units that we operate. There's a donate button, of course, so we'd love for you to donate. And there's a volunteer button, so you can donate with your time and talent or with your treasure. We think they're all great things to provide. And again, that's www.ccdenver.org. Go on the website, and you'll see all the amazing things that the people that work for Catholic Charities in Denver do. I have the great job of talking about it and taking credit for it. But you know, I have these amazing people that I get to work with that actually do all this stuff. And you know, one final thought about the abortion thing too. It's amazing how ethnically focused abortion is. You know, if you're a woman of color, you're much more likely to wind up having an abortion than a Caucasian woman, as an example. And if you live in poverty, you're much more likely to have an abortion than if you don't live in poverty. And those children are just as beautiful, just as smart, just as deserving of a life as, you know, a Caucasian, wealthy, you know, child from a mother that's not thinking about it. So, I mean, it's really a travesty. I just want to point that out. You know, that abortion is this medical service for women is a bunch of nonsense. It's just not the case. And it's a fallacy that's been purported out there, especially by Planned Parenthood, that really needs to be addressed on a regular basis. Every chance we get to talk about that as an absolute diabolical service, we need to talk about. But we need to make sure that we are providing an alternative that gives these women the ability to know that they're loved and that there is a way for them to have a life with their child.
Yeah. And I appreciate you sharing that. You know, it really highlights the fact that, again, that poverty is a foundational issue, a foundational justice concern, and that so many other concerns sort of come out of the roots of that, whether it's abortion, whether it's other types of vulnerabilities, whether it's disease, whether it's lack of services. all of these are sort of offspring of, sadly, poverty. And so we really appreciate all that you're doing to provide that holistic approach to addressing these concerns in our community. Well, I want to thank you, Larry Smith, for taking the time with us today as the President and CEO of Catholic Charities-Denver, but also as this concerned citizen who is concerned and actively engaging on the issue of poverty. We appreciate all that you shared with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. And please join us again as we share our recording of this session along with our study guide. The study guide provides you more information about this topic and resources, as well as questions for you to ponder and continue the discussion. We hope you'll join us again for our next session of Biblical Justice A to X. Thank you.